Warning: the following video contains real stories of organized crime. It contains graphic descriptions and mature language. The views and opinions expressed within do not necessarily represent the views and opinions held by Chronicles or its affiliates. Viewer discretion is advised.
On February 2nd, 1986, at the age of 17, Jaime shot and killed a man on the south side of Phoenix. In those days in Phoenix, Arizona, there were streets where if one wanted to acquire illegal substances or sexual favors, a person need only go to certain streets. As one drove down one of these streets, people would run up to your car offering whatever it was they had for sale. Different corners were known for different substances. For example, if one wished to acquire heroin, you'd pull up to the corner in question, and a few men would run up to your car offering whatever you had money for. Jaime and his cousins, having drunk beer all day, decided to go to Broadway Avenue to rob an individual they knew had cocaine. The plan was to pull up to the corner, and as the individual ran up to serve them, Jaime was to snatch whatever he had in his hand and they would drive away. However, as was often the case, the person on the corner had the same plan in mind for the next car that pulled up. As luck would have it for both men, Jaime and his cousins were in the next car. Pulling up to the corner, the individual ran up as if to serve Jaime. Playing his part, showed him some money in his hand to show this was a serious buyer. The server then reached in the car, snatching the money from Jaime's hand and punching him in the face. Before he could turn away, Jaime lifted the handgun he had in his lap and fired into the server's face, killing him. Jaime was ultimately arrested and charged as an adult and sent to prison. Jaime pled guilty to manslaughter and received 9 years. Jaime's classification score brought him to a medium security prison called South Unit in the Florence complex in Florence, Arizona. The first day of prison brought Jaime an embarrassing moment in which he went to the chow hall for his first meal in prison. Not really knowing the layout or the rules, Jaime saw a table with only one individual eating. As he recognized this person as someone from his dormitory, Jaime, with his tray, sat down to eat. His mistake was quickly realized when he was approached by an older Mexican-American Chicano and questioned as to his racial makeup. Jaime responded that he too was a Chicano, and the older individual responded with, "I thought so," and told Jaime to follow him. As they walked to the section of the chow hall that belonged to the Chicanos, the older individual explained to Jaime that this was in fact their section, and that where he had sat was the white section, and pointed out the black section as well. He told Jaime from now on, sit in this section. After chow, the 3 Chicanos that had sat with Jaime and asked him the usual question one gets when entering prison: what you here for, how much time you got, and where you from, walked him back to his cubicle and seemed to inspect its contents. As he had just gotten to prison, it was empty. Seeing this, the older Chicano, who Jaime learned was named Fernando Nunez, also known as Wimpy, told one of the other guys, Louis Perez, also known as Jaguar, to get him whatever he needed, and then walked away. After this first encounter, Jaime hung out with these guys pretty much regularly. There were quite a few of them that hung out together and had seemed to take a liking to Jaime. If you ask Jaime about those days, he'll tell you he was a naive kid. He had no idea these guys were MM members. And the first time he realized who they were, he saw one of the guys, Gary Güero Ibarra, on the yard restroom standing with his shirt off. And in big, bold old English letters, across his back, it said Mafia Mexicana. Jaime said he thought to himself, okay, now I get why they all run this place. But he just kept to his routine and working out and boxing training with one of the guys he really looked up to, William Big Spider Lopez, as did many of the youngsters of the day. The first year or so, Jaime was what is labeled in the Arizona Amish structure as esquina. Those familiar with the California structure would correlate this with being a camarada. He did small favors for the carnales. One example of these favors was in South Unit is next door to Central Unit, the Walls. And in the Walls, there's a section called CB6, where at this time Death Row was housed. And it was used as sort of a lockdown section. When convicts went out to recreation while housed at CB6, they were placed in recreation cages. They were not too far from the fence that separated from South Unit. There was a guard tower at this point where a guard could keep watch of both sides. When some of the carnales that were in CB6 at the time would go out to recreate, there'd be someone that would get the guard's attention in the tower. While talking to that guard, Jaime and other esquina would sneak under the tower and throw golf ball sized packages filled with heroin and other contraband over the fence, landing on top of the recreation cages where they would fall through the top of the chain link and keep the carnales in CB6 happy. This was also done with weapons. The South Unit had a metal shop, and inmates would manufacture 10 to 12-inch metal shanks that were then smuggled out of the shop inside hollowed out 2x4s that were glued shut. One side of the metal shop, they would be smashed open, and the metal shanks were then thrown over the fence to be stockpiled in the walls. In this way, the carnales in the walls stayed fully stocked with weapons and never needed to ask for one when needed. Of course, in those days, killings and knifings was an everyday occurrence in Florence. They didn't even lock the yards down the way they do today. You just see a helicopter fly in and out, and life went on. The prison guards were like a prison gang themselves in those days, beating inmates, taking sides in conflicts, and much more. We'll explore on another day. Eventually, after receiving multiple disciplinary reports, Jaime found himself being transferred there. At first housed in CB4, but eventually moved to CB3, which was unofficially considered the gang block, where most carnales from La M and AB members were housed. One incident that stands out was after a while of being in CB3, Jaime was playing craps through the cell bars with an inmate named Tomas Coco. Tomas was a quiet dude that usually kept to himself, but he liked to gamble. So this day he gets into debt with Jaime. He's $30 down payable that day at commissary. But prior to commissary, he bets Jaime the $30 against his JVC boombox and loses. So Jaime gives him a store list for $30 and an address for him to send the boombox to from the property room that day. So it was a windy day, and Tomas asked Jaime to hold the property room door open for him as he fills out the form to release the boombox. The door is actually a metal half door. The bottom half stays closed as you did your business there. As Jaime is holding the door, he's called away by a carnal named Dan, Dirty Dan Gastelum, and the door gets slammed into Tomas's head by the wind. Tomas gets mad and yells at Jaime saying, "Hold the effing door, MFer." And Jaime replies, "What, man? F you." So it turns out Dan had called Jaime over to make a change on Tomas's store list, asking him to put 2 pints of ice cream on the lista. So now, after the verbal altercation, Jaime goes back to Tomas and tells him to add the pints. Tomas, already upset from losing and then getting hit in the head by the door, steps into Jaime's space and says, "I ain't gonna be changing this lista every 5 minutes, MFer," while pointing his finger at Jaime's face. Dirty Dan intervenes and stops them from going further. But Tomas then tells Jaime, "You know what, little MFer? Llévate tu pico a la yarda when we go out to the field right now." Basically telling Jaime to bring his shank out to the yard, that they're going to have a knife fight. So returning to the cell block, Jaime went straight to his cell and dug out the shank he had hidden in his cell. While in the cell, many people were calling Jaime as he was the pod porter, and commissary had just been run. They were trying to get him to pass items for them. When the door was open, Jaime and Dan went up the tier to a couple of carnales' cells to let them know what had transpired. Dan tells Randy, Sleepy Bernal, and Ricardo Buddy Garcia what had been said, and Jaime tells them he was going to stick him as soon as the doors open. At first, Sleepy says, "Nah, don't do that. We got other stuff going on right now." And Buddy chimed in and says, "Just make him apologize." But Dan spoke up and said, "No, he was talking to him like he was a punk in front of everyone." Then Sleepy asks Jaime, "Do you have a pico?" And Jaime shows him the one he had. It was one of the ones that the carnales had him holding, and recognizing it, Sleepy tells Jaime to not use that one because that one was for inside. He turns to Dan and says, "Get him one from the yarda." So it's settled. As soon as the yard opened, Jaime would get a shank from Dan and hit Tomas for his disrespect. Once out on the yard, Jaime walked a few laps with Dan where he instructed Jaime as to where the weapon was. Along the fence line, there was a piece of paper that had a string tied to it, and pulling the string would dislodge the 12-inch double-edged metal shank buried in the ground. Jaime stuck the shank in his waistband and waited on Tomas to come out with his, as he said he would. Tomas, being an older convict, misjudged Jaime as a youngster he could frighten with tough talk. So as he reached the court, he pointed inside and said, "Are you ready? Get your little ass in there." As Jaime backed up into the handball court, Tomas balled up his fist and assumed the boxing position and attacked Jaime. As he did so, Jaime pulled out the shank, grabbed Tomas by his throat, and proceeded to stab him a few times in his rib cage. Tomas turned to run out of the court, and Jaime stabbed him again. The shank was so sharp that it basically filleted open his back like a fish. Tomas took about 10 steps out of the court and collapsed under the watchful eye of the tower guard. However, by then the court was empty and Jaime had cleaned up. Tomas was airlifted out to the hospital but survived. Upon his return, they housed him in a separate section where most enemies of the M were housed. However, he wrote Jaime an apology letter and sent him $30 in commissary, honoring his debt. Jaime always respected him for that. Jaime was 19 years old when this incident took place, and the Carnales took note and respected him for it. In those days, CV3 was M headquarters, and most Skina looked at it as a privilege to be called upon to put in work. The Raza would actually jump at the opportunity to take out a target of the Lismos. Although everyone seemed to get along in there, it seemed every couple weeks someone needed to be hit. By 1990, Jaime was a lot sharper to the ways of the Lismo and had been putting in work solidly throughout his time. One day he was told to go to the law library. He was surprised when he went and saw the number of Carnales there. By this time, the ranking system had been in effect for a little over a year now, and all ranks were represented that day. Captains, lieutenants, and sergeants. Jaime was sitting reading some case law when he was approached by Angel Crow Rivera, who said, "What are you reading, Carnalito?" Up to this point, he had never called Jaime that, so it was somewhat surprising. And Jaime responded that he was reading some case law. Crow responded by saying, "You want to see my shit where I dusted that víbora?" He was alluding to the hit on the old Mexican Mafia member Tuva Dominguez that he and Ruben Slackjaw Melendez had done. After this conversation, the Carnales carried on having their meeting, which Jaime, not being a Carnal at the time, was not a part of. However, he would shortly come to understand what the meeting was about. The following day on the yard, everyone filled ice chests with soda and ice and played handball. Then Big Spider told Jaime that a meeting would be conducted later. He assumed it would be all the raza, as he would not have been invited if it was a Lismo meeting. Jaime went to the outside restroom to wash up and cool down when he noticed a lot of Carnales going to the dugout of the baseball field. Then Dirty Dan came up and told Jaime, "Hurry up, the meeting is starting now." As Jaime got to the meeting, he noticed there was no other raza there. And then Sleepy spoke up, saying to Big Spider, "You want to do the honors, or you want me to?" Spider said, "You do it." Then Sleepy said that they had voted the day before in the law library, and everybody wanted to bring him into the familia, and that if he accepted, he'd be the youngest carnal to ever be made. They told him to think about it, that it was his choice. Jaime had just turned 21 years old and was shocked that he was being asked this. He looked at Spider and asked what he thought. Spider answered, "I wouldn't be here if I didn't want you to be a part of this familia." Jaime hadn't anticipated this, but inside he was elated. He felt honored. And so he said, "Yes, I do." Crow swore him in, and Jaime recited the oath. When that was done, his hand was shook. He was hugged and congratulated by more than 20 carnales that were in attendance. Jaime says when he got back to his cell and was laying there, he felt like yelling at the top of his lungs. He had a sense of pure joy and happiness. He felt like the baddest youngster around. Now he'll readily admit it was a life sentence in the making. A bleak future was ahead. A few more years passed, then October 1992, Jaime was paroled. This is where we'll end for now. In our next episode, we will continue to profile Jaime's journey as a carnal on the streets and ultimately back inside. Thank you for tuning in to